straight off the bat, people who attend my sessions and hear me talk, no two sessions are alike. I mean, majority of the topic is the same, but I do interject different stories here and there, whatever just comes up. So everybody's in for a treat every session.
Well, you're closing us out, so take all the time you need. We're really excited.
I appreciate that. And I was actually in on Eric's previous session, and it's amazing that he actually has the poop symbol as a column name, you know, which is, I just kept thinking, how did he do that? But anyway, so this session is Big Data Cluster for the Absolute Beginner. I have the abstract up in case people are watching and they didn't get a chance to read the abstract. I titled it Absolute Beginner because that was me. I'll say coming up to a year ago, and that's how time flies by so fast. Now I would consider myself a beginner, right? So I know a lot, but there's still a lot more to know. And the abstract is mainly for individuals that are a DBA or database professional that feel like their skills are becoming irrelevant, right? When they pay attention to social media and the news out there, all this new technology coming out, especially like, let's say, Azure, and all this tech-related products and services, you can quickly become like demotivated, right? If you're working at a job where you feel like, you know, your company's not adopting this new technology, right? That rate is a little bit different than the rate at which the technology comes out at. And it can be a little bit daunting, right? So this is for that individual. So let's go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Mohammad Darab. That's my email right there. I also have my contact at the end, so you'll see that. A little bit about myself. I am from the DC area, close to 20 years in IT, and a little over 10 years of that working with SQL Server. This year, I'm honored to be part of the Idera ACE program for those people who are familiar with that. If they're not, it's just the company Idera that provides the products, database products, and monitoring tools. They sponsor a group of people every year. Every year is a new batch of people that get selected. And then Idera sponsors those individuals as they do their speaking engagements around the world. So I'm part of that this year. Appreciate that. Online, mohammeddarab.com. I blog heavily about big data clusters. That's my new big passion. So if you go there, you'll see a lot of this stuff, this session, a lot more stuff you will see on my blog. And on Twitter, if you're on Twitter at MWDarab, feel free to reach out. Agenda. I like to use the quotes here because, again, like I mentioned, I like to talk a lot about a lot of stories, interject stories. I feel like through stories we can relate, right? So take this with a quote unquote grain of salt here. I'm going to talk about the history. What is a BDC in terms of Microsoft's definition, right? The architecture, more like a high bird's eye view. Features, most thoughts, that's me, Mohammed, and I'll tell you why I believe you should be excited, right? It took me a while to get excited, and if anybody knows me, they know I'm a pretty lazy individual, right? So in order for me to get off my butt to do something, especially like this, talking about this type of stuff, I have to really believe in it, right? Otherwise, I'm just like, I'm either, my wife says it's because I'm a Gemini, I don't know, but I either do it or I don't do it, right? So I'll tell you about that, and then I'll leave you with the learning path. And if you've noticed at the bottom there, mohammeddarab.com/BDC, everything is up there. So you don't have to take notes, you don't have to do anything, just sit back and relax. As they said, this is the last session, so let's kind of just, probably your brains have been fried with Eric's video, so this is probably gonna be a little bit different than that. So, history. Back in 2016, I remember when SQL Server came out with a feature called Polybase. Usually when I give this talk to SQL Saturdays, I ask people who in here has heard of Polybase or actually used Polybase. Only like 2 or 3 hands go up. It's one of those features where when it came out, I understood the concept. I actually remember I was sitting in a SQL user group in my area when I was actually watching a presentation by Microsoft PFE introducing this feature and a couple other features. And I remember thinking, Polybase, okay, so you can reach out from your relational database, SQL Server, you can reach out to Hadoop, Cloudera, Hortonworks, and you know, combine data. But at the time, I mean, it was 2016, and I think it was end of 15, and I'm working on servers that are running 2008, 2005. So like this was just, it really didn't resonate with me. I understood it conceptually, but really didn't care. It didn't interest me that much. But if you remember, that's when that came out, 2016. In 2017, in my view, that was huge. That was just, I mean, SQL Server on Linux, right? I remember when I heard that, the first thing popped in my head was why, right? Why would anybody put SQL Server on Linux, right? I'm not a Linux guy. I'm Windows guy. I do click next. I see a lot of GUI stuff, command line stuff like that is kind of like a foreign language to me. I'm kind of scared of it, right? Even it took me a while to get with PowerShell. I mean, if it wasn't for DBA tools, I probably wouldn't have touched much of PowerShell, right? But that being said, in 2017, that was a huge move. Now, looking back, it's even bigger, and we're going to go down the timeline and you'll see further. And now that SQL Server was introduced onto Linux, they also can deploy SQL Server on a container using container technology. So that was a big shift, paradigm shift with SQL Server in 2017. 2019, you all have probably heard, if you're in the news, in the community, on social media, enhanced Polybase, right? They came out with something called enhanced Polybase. So what is enhanced Polybase? Or you've probably heard it called Polybase plus plus, right? The next version or next iteration of Polybase. All that is, and I tell people, all that is the original Polybase, but with more connectors, right? So if you look down at the image here, and I'm looking there, you see Cloudera, Spark, they've added that, Hortonworks, but now you can actually connect to Oracle, Teradata, SQL Server, NoSQL, ODBC services. So it's really expanded, right? So actually what I should do is I should actually bold and underline enhanced, right? Can you imagine you're sitting at your SQL server and you can actually query an Oracle server and get that data back. So you don't have to use ETL and SSIS packages and things like that. You can just query the data and bring it back and manipulate it any way you want. That to me was mind blowing. Like I just remember, you can do what? Like that really sparked my interest to get off the couch, right? Because I'm lazy. So on top of that, they've also introduced availability groups on the Kubernetes cluster. So that's a beast in itself, right? Not only can you deploy SQL Server on containers, but now you can also use Kubernetes, which we'll talk about, but also HA and DR technology with SQL Server availability groups on Kubernetes. So it's like Microsoft is just changing the game, so to speak, big time. So I wanted to clarify a couple of concepts here. I got this question one of the first times I presented this, so I put this slide in here: Polybase versus link servers, right? So on the left, you see Polybase is database scope versus link servers, that's more instance server scope, right? Polybase, for example, at the bottom there, suitable for analytical queries, processing large number of rows, right? Link servers, on the other hand, single or few rows. I actually know a couple environments where they use link servers for just data warehouse, massive amounts of queries. It keeps timing out. There's always errors and stuff. And I personally, I do not like link servers, but those are the differences right there. And for example, for link servers, you need separate configuration, right? For each instance on an AG, but Polybase, you just need one. So it takes care of everything. Moving on. By the way, again, if anybody has any questions or whatnot, feel free to ask, and they'll ask me, and then we can address them as I go on. So now I want to talk about concepts. Somebody say anything?
Oh, sorry, none so far, but I'll let you know.
Okay, cool. So I want to stress one thing is I'm talking about concepts here, right? So if you're a DBA, you've been working, again, I'm that DBA, right? I've been working with Windows my entire life. All of a sudden, here comes SQL Server now on Linux, right? And we're talking about big data clusters now. It took me months and months to understand certain concepts here. I mean, I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed, but I just want to reiterate, anybody in there that's probably confused or thinking, what the heck is this or that? It's normal, right? It takes time. This information will be up. You can reach out to me later if you don't want to ask questions now, whatnot, but just sit back and relax. And the biggest thing is the concepts, understanding the concepts. So what is a container? You all have probably heard of Docker, right? The term Docker, it's a company called Docker. They produce a product called a Docker engine, right? So you download this, you install it on your server. Now you have this Docker engine that you can actually instantiate images to become containers, running containers, right? So initially, I remember when I first heard about containers, as a production DBA, it doesn't really pertain to me, right? So I remember asking, even on Twitter, I used to ask, like, what is containers? Like, what are containers? People said, oh, you can just download an image and instantiate a container of SQL Server, right? And I just kept asking like, okay, and then what, right? Like, what's the point? What's the end goal, right? You just have it for having its sake. But again, hindsight's 2020. So now I feel like the fool. I should have just probably sat back and analyzed a little bit more. But a container, for those who don't know, right? And it's one of those words where it's hard to describe it without using the word container, right? So imagine a shipping container, those big shipping containers on the shipping dock, right? Big metal container. Now imagine you put, let's say, and I like to use the example, a band, a music band, right? The person who's playing the piano, the drum, the guitar, whatever, you shove them in the container, you put in every instrument, every type of tool and thing they need to play music, right? You shut the container. Now, if I was to lift that container, because I'm the Hulk all of a sudden, but if I was to lift that container and move it anywhere, right? Go to the moon, go to China, go to Afghanistan, wherever, right? They can still play music perfectly fine. I mean, of course, they need air, right? You have to allow them oxygen, but that being, that's just a small little thing, right? They can play it. So imagine you replace the musical instruments and the people with application libraries and DLLs and specifics that need for that application to run, right? So that's all in the container. And you can literally deploy it and then have that container on a different VM, on a different server, and it'll still run fine, right? So that's pretty much a container, or the concept of it. And Docker being the big kahuna in the market, you'll see Docker a lot if you haven't seen it already. And it's one of those things where if you've never seen Docker or never heard of containers, now you're going to start hearing about them. The more you look around and pay attention, it might start popping out at you. Now, one thing I want to say is, with containers, you need something called Kubernetes, right? Originally developed by Google, but Kubernetes is, for lack of a better term, a container orchestrator, right? So it takes these containers and it moves it around and scales things out and scales things down and according to need, right? Because a container just a running application or running image, that's it, right? So Kubernetes is the go-to orchestrator, container orchestrator technology out there right now. So you'll see, and in fact, I'm actually wearing the shirt and you'll see the logo. That logo is a, and somebody asked me what that logo is. It's the steering wheel, I guess. They don't call it steering wheel, right? Of a ship, right? And Kubernetes, I believe, means helmsman, whatever. Like, I think that's the driver of that ship or whatnot, but I don't want to bore you with the specific details of like what the meaning of Kubernetes is, but conceptually understand that Kubernetes is in charge of the containers. So if you really want to have a picture of it, going back to that shipping dock example, if you have all those containers, you usually see a big arm that goes around, grabs the container, moves it, right, puts it on. That arm, think of that arm as like Kubernetes, right, is in control of all the containers, right? So now everything that happens with Kubernetes happens within the context of a cluster, right? A Kubernetes cluster. And itself, Kubernetes is really nothing. Kubernetes cluster is where it starts to shine, right? So if you see here on the screen, in the middle there, what is that, like a hexagon? Or I don't know, how many sides is that?
I think that'd be a heptagon because it has 7 sides.
Heptagon, yeah.
Have it help.
Okay. So heptagon, you see the master node, right? So a Kubernetes cluster consists of a master node and then n number of worker nodes, right? And that master is in charge of distribution of work, right? Now, the rest of worker nodes, master in charge, yeah, and they're a set of machine called nodes. So those machines can be a physical machine or a virtual machine, right? Those nodes. So when you see, for example, you'll see this, and this are the worker nodes, right? These are actual VMs, right? Or physical machines. Let's go with the VM example. So if I wanted to create a, let's say, 6-node or a 3-node Kubernetes cluster, I go over to my VM admin and I say, hey, can you create me 3 VMs, right? X number of CPU, RAM, whatever. And then you create the first one, right, would be the master node, right? And then you create the other 2 as a worker node. You join them to the master cluster, the Kubernetes cluster. And then you have this Kubernetes cluster. Now, a pod is the smallest unit in Kubernetes that Kubernetes, I guess for a lack of better thing, does stuff with, right, is the smallest compute, the smallest form, right, is that if you take a container that has that image running on it, Kubernetes will come in and take that container and wrap it into a pod. And then everything that Kubernetes does is to the pod, right? And then the pod translates everything to the container, right? So pod, again, is a logical group of one or more containers and associated resources. And this is, it took me a while to actually understand this and kind of wrap my head around it. And I tell people whenever I speak to them, I say it takes me a while to read this. A pod runs on a node, and the node can run one or more pods, right? So usually around this time, people kind of, you know, they're like, what, you know? It's like those Russian dolls where like just keeps going in, right? Those little, I don't even know what you call them. But hopefully this next image will clarify, which I actually drew, so please do not make fun of my Picasso skills. But starting with the smallest square on the left, picture that an image, right? So like I go to SQL, I go to the Microsoft Hub, download the SQL Server image. That's the square on the left, right here. Once you quote unquote instantiate it, right? Use a Docker engine to make it a container, then you have the box right over, right? So the image running becomes a container, right? Now, the rest, that's where you start getting into Kubernetes. So now you want to have Kubernetes and you have a container inside a pod, right? Now the pod is put a part of a node, which was that physical machine or that VM, right? And then that node is part of this cluster right here, right? Where you have the master in the middle, you have in the middle, right? But you have the master and then you have the workers around it, right? So what the statement was saying before, which I can actually add on to that to either lessen confusion or add to the confusion, but you can have, what they're saying is you can have multiple containers, right, on a pod. You can have multiple pods on a node, and then of course you get multiple nodes in a Kubernetes cluster. So as we dive in deeper, you'll see the images of what I'm talking about. Hopefully this sheds light on any confusion, because it definitely did for me when I was first doing it. So this is the biggest question for me, right? It's like, why? Why is Microsoft doing this? Why is Microsoft coming out with Polybase 16, 17? They have, you know, on Linux, that was huge. Why? And then why are they going with this enhanced Polybase, right? What's this fascination with Linux and containers and Kubernetes? So I like to relate this to like the goal for example, a professional like myself, or even you all are watching part of this, watching it later, you want to remain relevant, right? You don't want to, I mean, who wants to like study a skill or work on a skill that's going to be, you know, off the market in a year or two, right? You want to kind of stay up with the trends. And I feel like SQL Server, and the reason why Microsoft did this, of course, they don't go and tell you like, hey, this is our 5-year plan, or this is our 10-year plan, or this is our 1-year plan, right? But hindsight, again, is 2020. So when you look at the path that they're taking, they're putting a lot of investment and money in Linux and Kubernetes and you know, the container technology. And now with big data clusters, things are starting to become clear a little bit, right? So why? Just like I want to become relevant, I feel like SQL Server also wants to remain relevant, right? And you got to remain relevant with sticking with the times, right? And becoming cutting edge. I want to share a statistic right here. This actually for me was jaw-dropping when I first came across it. People that I usually share this with, half the room has never seen this. A lot of them have. But 90% of all data today was generated in the last 2 years. And I think this stat wasn't, it was like this year, it was like 2 years ago or something like that. So that's like, you know, like an exponential growth, right? And I'm talking to a camera right now, so I don't, you know, people maybe can chime in and put their thoughts in the chat. But I'd like to ask the audience, this 90% of this all data, what do you think this 90% of data is, right? This massive growth, what do you think that data is? I mean, I'll give like a couple seconds if people care to share. And speaking about that, I'll take a sip of water. So people usually blurt out social media, right? Social media. And I want to share with you another statistic that was even more mind-blowing to me than this, from Walmart. Give you a second to check that out. Walmart collects 2.5 petabytes of data from 1 million customers every hour, right? Again, I mentioned I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed. I was like, petabytes? What is that? That's like over terabytes, right? So 2.5 of data from 1 million customers every hour. Everything from Facebook messages, tweets, YouTube, Instagram, Pinterest, whatever, right? It doesn't even, I mean, blog posts. Like I have a blog. Maybe my stuff is, I don't know, right? They just pretty much download the internet, right? And wondering like why? Again, why are they doing this, right? By the way, I did another thing I wanted to mention here was Walmart has data on, I think, over 150 million customers, right? About 50–60% of those customers are adults, right? Of course, I mean, like, can you imagine like a little kid going to Walmart without a parent? But that's to say that they still have a lot of data on kids, right? Kids purchases, stuff like that. That's 1 million customers every hour. Just sit back and just imagine that, right? And I mentioned this, and actually the last, I was at SQL Saturday Orlando, and I mentioned that, has anybody heard of Walmart Labs? The company Walmart Labs, right? It's like a division of Walmart. I don't know if it's a division, but it's under the Walmart umbrella. It's called Walmart Labs if you haven't heard of it. And all this information right here that you see on the screen is being analyzed and processed and all this and that by them, Walmart Labs. So Walmart actually has a different like division that handles data analytics and all that, right? So that, I mean, that's mind-boggling. I want to share with you another quote from the Walmart CEO back in 2013. I'm trying to guess the next slide. Give you a second to read that. This, now, if you're like me, when I read that, I thought of Dr. Evil, right? From Austin Powers. I don't know, I just you know, imagine him doing this, you know? We want to know what every product in the world is. We want to know who every person in the world is, and we want to have the ability to connect them in a transaction, together in a transaction. That's like a little eerie, right? But that's, you know, that's what's going on. That's just Walmart, mind you, right? And that's just in retail, right? Amazon and all these other companies, huge companies, what are they doing, right? One story I want to share is, with all this information, all this data that Walmart gathers, they noticed that during a certain time of the year, sales of strawberry Pop-Tarts would spike 7 times, right? So it'd be like 1x, 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 and at a certain time it went 7x, right? So they started to dive a little deeper into, hey, you know, what the hell's going on, right? And they started to, you know, do their little, you know, eerie Dr. Evil stuff, you know, analytics and stuff, all the data scientists, all the smart people, and say, hey, what's going on right here? Why is it going 7x? They found out that during hurricane season, whenever there's a hurricane, specifically Florida, residents and those people, they love to purchase, they go to Walmart, they purchase strawberry Pop-Tarts. That blows my mind, you know? And when I was at SQL Saturday Orlando, I was like, hey man, what's up with y'all? Y'all like love strawberry Pop-Tarts when it's about to, you know, rain, you know, your roof's about to fly off your house, you buying strawberry Pop-Tarts, you know? But so Walmart found that out through that analytics of the big data. And now they push strawberry Pop-Tart front and center. Can you believe that? You walk in during a hurricane. I actually wanted to do that, but I'm not trying to be there during a hurricane to see if that's actually true. But all that information, again, are in the links in this thing to read it. It's a lot more eerie than what you see on the, I couldn't have like 15 slides of all this information, but yeah. So again, going back to why, right? All this is because, you know, all this enhancements with big data, with the future of big data cluster and Microsoft introducing this technology and going down this route, making this big investment in it, is because they want to remain relevant, right? And I think that's a huge opportunity for people who want to remain relevant with cutting edge technology. And I like to make the analogy that SQL Server is like the kid who was good at basketball, right? I'm a basketball fanatic. I'm like 92 Bulls, right? So, you know, Michael Jordan got cut from the freshman team, right? And then he goes, he's practicing, he shoots up like 6 inches, 8 inches, whatever during the summer, right? Comes back and starts annihilating everything, right? I feel like Microsoft is saying, hey, yes, I used to be, relational data only, 25 years, Windows only, right? Now it's a whole new game. Pick me, right? I can do everything, right? And I think that's a huge opportunity for the, the SQL DBA, the enthusiasts, even the newcomers, right? To learn this technology. I think it's just a huge, huge potential. So what is a BDC? We keep talking about big data and Erie and Dr. Evil. What is a big data cluster? So according to Microsoft definition, this is it. I'll give you a couple seconds. So BDCs, big data clusters, allow you to deploy scalable clusters, right, of SQL Server, Spark, and HDFS containers, right, running on Kubernetes cluster, right? These components are running side by side to enable you to read, write, and process big data from T-SQL or Spark, allowing you to easily combine and analyze your high-value relational data, right, with your high-volume big data. So it's a marriage of just a wide range of technologies that is coming in the form of a big data cluster. And by the way, a big data cluster would be nothing without the Kubernetes cluster, right? So a big data cluster just put on top of a Kubernetes cluster. So that's, we'll talk more about this as I go on, but so it becomes this artificial intelligence machine learning platform from A to Z, right? Or AI to ML or whatever. From the left, you see you have all the different type of data coming in from all different type of sources, unstructured, the IoT devices, SQL Edge. I just imagine like somebody, like a farmer, right? On a tractor, or they send drones to analyze stuff. They have all these different equipments, like John Deere has these programs where they can analyze big data. And now you have SQL Edge, right? And IoT, you can put them on IoT devices. This is just huge, right? And your regular relational databases, ingesting data, storing it, prepping it, training it, and serving it to your Power BI and all the other apps, right? So let's kind of quickly go through each one of these. So ingest, right? Data can be ingested by either Spark streaming, by inserting directly into HDFS, or directly into SQL Server via T-SQL. Data can be stored in files in HDFS, right? Or partitioned and stored in the data pool or data pools. We'll talk about pools and whatnot in a couple more slides. Stored in SQL Server master instance. We'll talk about that as well. In tables or graphs. The tables, graphs, or JSON XML. Prep and train. This is where I like to say the smart people come in, right? The data scientists, they come in, they actually do their Java, Python, right? Things that are like over my head, and they work right there. They prep and train right there in the confines of a big data cluster, right? And then again, modeling and serving it up, right? You have your BI tools, again, like I mentioned, Power BI, for example, right? And it's I mean, even now, like I mentioned in the beginning, I still consider myself a beginner because there's so much to learn, right? And I fall in love with it the more I research on it, right? Because it's just so much, it's so in depth. Just to learn Kubernetes in itself is huge, right? So architecture. I'll show you a little diagram. This diagram was taken from the Microsoft site, so you can go there and check it out. All I did to this diagram was I highlighted the dark, bold black, the red, and the green to kind of like pop it out for you. The green, the big green rectangle right there you see in the middle is the big data cluster itself, right? Imagine it being the cluster, and inside of that you have the black rectangles. Those are the pools, right? You can see there's a compute pool. Let me use the mouse, right? You see the compute pool, storage pool, data pool, application pool. Now this one right here that's outside of this green thing, this black one right here is a controller that's also inside the big data cluster. They just kind of have it outside, but if you see the two little lines, I did ask the team why is it outside? Is it, isn't it part of the cluster? And they mentioned that they just had some spacing issues. So with the design, so they're probably going to come out with a new image to actually incorporate it in there. But you see, again, this is the SQL Server master instance. So from a DBA standpoint, I log into the SQL Server master instance just like I'm logging into any other SSMS, Azure Data Studio, and I log in. All the compute pool, the storage pool, data pool, all that stuff is in a way, quote unquote, abstracted from me. I don't have to worry about that. All that stuff kind of happens in the background, right? I just need to worry about my endpoint to log into SQL Server, and that's it, which is a master instance. So we'll go into that in a couple more slides. So let's break each one of these down. The controller. Let me go back one slide. So the controller right there again on the upper left-hand side. The controller, when you deploy a big data cluster for the first time, the controller is built, right? And I like to envision it as you're building a robot or something, right? And the first thing that's built is the brain, right? And then the brain builds everything else. And that's pretty much what's happening here with the controller. So the controller hosts the core logic, again, deploying and managing a big data cluster. It takes care of all the interaction with Kubernetes, SQL Server instances that are part of the cluster, and also components like HDFS and Spark, Hadoop. So the controller provides the following functionality, right? Cluster lifecycle, bootstrap, delete, update, manages the master SQL, I mentioned that, manages a compute data storage pool. So it's like in control of everything, controller, right? The name controller. And also cluster security, which is very, very important. The next one is a master instance. So this is where, again, like I mentioned, you connect to, right? So as a DBA, I deploy a big data cluster, and then let's say a developer comes to me, they need access to SQL Server, or an application needs to be able to connect or whatever. I give them the endpoint of the master instance. That's it. Just like you would give the named instance or the IP address or whatever. You give that to the individual, and that's what they connect to, and that's the master instance, right? So connectivity provides an external accessible endpoint, just like I mentioned, right? You can connect via ADS or SSMS. I'll say recently, probably beginning of the year, I started using Azure Data Studio. It was slowly at first. I remember when I first installed it, I opened it and I deleted it. Like I was like, well, where's half the stuff, right? Just because I was used to SSMS for years. But as I'm getting into big data clusters, ADS is actually, I mean, I love it. I absolutely love it now. And you start to see why they have a tool like ADS, right? So if you're out there and you're watching and you really haven't played with ADS, I highly recommend that you do get a little comfortable with it. Again, the scale out query management is in the master instance, right? So it's in charge of sending appropriate queries to the compute pool, right? Which we'll talk about. I believe, is that the next slide? Oh, well, let's continue with the master. Machine learning services is on the master instance, right? The database engine, right? So you enable it, and then you can execute Java or Python. Again, smart people coming in, this is where they get into the master instance, and they just work. I mean, again, it's all within the confines of SQL Server. This isn't like you have to connect to some other server, some other, it's all within the big data clusters. All you think about is a SQL Server master instance you connect to, everything else abstracted, and you're AI ML platform. I mean, that to me, I still find that amazing. The compute pool, like the name suggests, is in charge of computation, right? So they have multiple SQL Server instances in there that are just for compute power. That's it. The pods in the compute pool are divided into SQL Server compute instances for distributed queries, specifically Polybase, right? So like if you're querying some data that's outside of the SQL Server and needs to be aggregation or anything like that, it can handle all of that in the compute pool. It doesn't have to bug the master instance with that CPU. Main role for the compute pool is to perform intermediate joins, aggregations, and multiple external tables. The data pool. So data pool is used to persist data. So when you're grabbing data, let's say from Oracle or any other outside source, and you need it to be cached, it's in the data pool, right? For further analysis, so things become a little bit faster. The storage pool consists of pods comprised of SQL Server on Linux, Spark, and HDFS, right? Again, like I mentioned, hindsight's 2020, right? So SQL Server on Linux, Hadoop, right? Pods, Kubernetes. All the storage nodes in the SQL Server Big Data Cluster are members of an HDFS cluster. So if you bring your attention down to this red box right here, you'll see now these, I guess squares and also rectangles, but these individual like Spark, SQL Server, HDFS are containers, right? Running the service, right? So the Spark server, the SQL Server, HDFS. So they're all on the same pod. And they're just pretty much like meshed together, right? But they're running their separate different services, right? But they're just, I mean, blending SQL Server with Linux and Spark and HDFS, again, mind-blowing. Like It's really showing the path that Microsoft is taking, and to me, just amazing. It gives me that motivation again to get up from my lazy butt, right, and spend the time and energy and money and whatever to learn this stuff, right? And I truly believe, again, this is and I do make a statement of this being the future of SQL Server, and I'll talk about that in a couple more slides. I can easily go off topic and start talking about my passion, but I gotta stay on point here. So the storage pool continued. They're responsible for data ingestion through Spark, data storage in HDFS, data spread across all storage nodes for in the BDC. So if you have different HDFS nodes, the data spread across them for persistency. Data access through HDFS and SQL Server endpoints. Again, going to Azure Data Studio, SSMS. Now, Kubernetes storage. Kubernetes in itself, from my understanding, does not actually have storage per se, but it does act as the gatekeeper, so to speak, right? So you present storage to a cluster, right? To a Kubernetes cluster, and then you configure it to say, hey, pod, you can access this storage, right? And in order to access that storage, you will need a PVC, right? So that PVC, or persistent volume claim, is like a ticket, so to speak. So imagine like you're at the DMV, right? And you pull your ticket, and finally, when your time is up to go up to the gate after like what, 4 or 5 hours, you give them the ticket, and they're like, okay, yeah, they'll help you. Imagine if you don't have the ticket, or if you lost it, or like my son, like, ripped it up or whatever, right? It'll be hard. They can easily just say no, and you have to go back, wait in line for another like day. So just imagine that conceptually you have storage, you have your Kubernetes cluster, and the pods are inside, and they need to communicate with the storage. They use the PVC, and then the Kubernetes consider like controller will allow that to happen. If you don't have that PVC, it stops and just bounces you, gives you an error. You can't connect to it, right? So that's how storage works with Kubernetes. Now, for example, when I deploy a big data cluster, just for testing and playing around, I use AKS, or Azure Kubernetes Service. I think that's the fastest way to deploy it, is easiest, and they take care of all the storage on the back end. So it's in my view, it's the quickest way to get a big data cluster up, and then go back into your portal in Azure and see all the different PVCs and all the different storage that they create for you and for each node. It's interesting. So continuing on, endpoints. So the question arises, if I have a big data cluster, right, how can I get in, right? How secure is it? Can people kind of hack in this and that? There's only 3 endpoints to a big data cluster, and they're right there. Using AZ data to the controller, Azure Data Studio to Spark HDFS gateway, or again, Azure Data Studio SSMS, or your ODBC connections, right? Using straight into the master instance. Let's see, I think the next slide, there we go. So the controller endpoint, big data cluster management service that exposes the REST APIs for managing the cluster API. Let me take you back 1 second here. This right here, AZ data, is a command line tool that you download, you install on your machine. And this allows you to, again, connect, right? Using commands, you can create a cluster, delete a cluster, stuff like that, using AZ data, just a command line tool. HDFS and Spark, HTTPS-based endpoint, and then again, the master instance, a regular SQL Server master instance, TDS endpoint for database tools, application connections, you give them that. Now, features. Data virtualization. This to me was, I guess, it boiled down to this thing right here that made me pop out of my off the couch, so to speak, and get into big data clusters with data virtualization. Now, this is mainly via Polybase, right? Enhanced Polybase. You can connect to, for example, Mongo, Oracle, HDFS, and pull the data down, right? But the integration of Polybase, or this enhanced Polybase with big data clusters, and being able to provide this this beast, for lack of a better word, that you can sit at log into and connect to any other source, right? And bring that data back, which they call there a data hub, right? Allows you to grab all this data and have this virtual layer, right, of data. Just amazing. This data virtualization for me just blew me away. This right here is where I was like, I'm getting into big data clusters. Because it really makes it unique. There are services out there and products where you can deploy a big data cluster and all these, not a big data cluster, but the Azure Bricks and all these other different services. But this actually combines everything in one environment, right? Where you ETL really don't need it much, right? SSIS packaging, getting data from, let's say, an Oracle and massaging it, putting it into this and that. You do everything from SQL Server, right? Hadoop, big data, everything in one environment, huge. Again, Azure Data Studio, for those people who are a big question mark about it, get into it slowly, right? And kind of get used to it. Data lakes, obviously, if you can connect, if you have these different streams coming in, right? IoT devices, all these other things coming into your big data cluster, you have a data lake, right? You have all these different sources coming in, and then you can just, I mean, it's just amazing at what you can do. Now, I'm not a data scientist by any stretch of the means, right? Or the imagination. And if you can provide them something where it's like, hey, everything is under this, you just log into this one point and do whatever you want, right? Could you just imagine? Like, I actually was talking again with the stories, right? So last year I took my son, he started kindergarten, right? 5-year-old, we're at the bus stop. First day of school, and I'm kind of nervous, right? Any parents, they know the first day, kid's gonna cry, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, we were kind of prepared for that. And we're standing there, and all these kids are like crying, right? They're just like, eh, crying and like hugging on their mom's knees and their dad's knees. And I hear a voice, and the voice says, are you in IT, right? Mind you, I was wearing a SQL Saturday shirt. I was wearing something IT related. I don't remember exactly what shirt I was wearing, but I heard, are you in IT? And I ignored it at first because, you know, it wasn't like a tap on my shoulder. I'm not going to be like, you talking to me? Like, I just, you know, unless you like come to me, you know, I don't know. I'm not going to interject and somebody else is like, turn around and they're talking to somebody else. Like, oh, never mind. But, and then he said it again. And I'm thinking, UNIT? I'm thinking like Queen Latifah, like UNIT, why? But so I turn around and it's my neighbor, right? And my neighbor's asking me if I'm in IT, and I realized, oh, my shirt. So it sparked a conversation. So I was like, oh, yeah, I am. And I find out, you know, what do you do? I love to talk, right? So like asking him what he does, and he says he's a data scientist. And as soon as he said that, it's like, you too smart, man. You know, like, you're a data scientist. That's not me. I'm just, you know, I'm production DBA, right? I'm relational data, you big data. That's like, to me, two different worlds back then. And but I was curious though, right? So I asked him, I was like, so, like, you know, who do you work for? Like, what's your typical day? And he says, yeah, I work for, I forgot what the name of the pharmaceutical company is, but he works for a pharmaceutical company, right? And he's in charge of coming out with algorithms and analyzing data for drug research, like the FDA, different phases for a drug approval process. And he's part of this group that's supposed to like, use machine learning with algorithms and predict all this type of behavior and stuff, information from all this data, and hopefully decrease the amount of time that it takes to put a drug to market. Which when he said that, it kind of blew my mind. I'm like, so with ML, with machine learning, you're doing this, like, you know, and back in the day, can you imagine like people going to doing surveys and trying to figure out like, oh, if you take this drug, what happens to you, this and that. Now they already have all this data, but now they can analyze it a lot quicker. So instead of it taking 2 or 3 years for like the first phase to go through, it'll be like 8 months or whatever. I mean, this is him telling me this example. And I'm thinking, wow. And then I think shortly after that, I found out about big data clusters. I'm like, ha, right? So that's just a quick story. And then I actually talked to him later, and he said that the biggest thing is that the setup, right? So it's the setup of getting, in this case, let's say big data cluster, getting a big data cluster set up, configured, right? Understanding what's going on, if there's some troubleshooting needs, getting it set up and then handing it off to the data scientist. I'm not handing it off, but giving them the access to do their work, right? It's the setup. And when he said that, it kind of, again, right? So again, I mean, I just wanted to bring that up, because it's amazing once you get into something and your mind is on that thing, how much you start seeing that. Like, we're talking with people, and, you know, it's kind of like when you interested in the Toyota Camry, and then you start driving around and all you see is like a Toyota Camry. But anyway, Data Mart, again, different sources coming in. You can use it, you know, cache in your data pool for further analysis. Hope I'm good on time. Oh, 45. Okay, most thoughts, like as if I haven't been giving you my thoughts all this time, right? I'm super excited about big data clusters, but it really comes down to, you know, it doesn't matter how excited I am, right? It comes down to how excited and motivated can I get you to be, right? So why you should be excited. Number one, like I was mentioning, one-stop shop, right? Everything happening within the confines of a big data cluster. Again, if you're not, you know, if a lot of these concepts are going over your head, do not worry, take time, go back, the link right there at the bottom, you'll find a lot of my big data cluster posts and stuff like that are there. It takes time, but it is a one-stop shop. So I don't have to go, when I set up a big data cluster, go deal much with ETL and SSIS, or go to a data scientist, for example, and say, hey, can I get your laptop or put your project or your information on a thumb drive? I got to take it out and put it back into, you know, a different sort of file share and put it in. Everything, you give them access to everything, right? All within the confines of SQL Server. All this is done by SQL Server, one-stop shop. Now, if you haven't picked up on it, I believe the most unique feature of a big data cluster is data virtualization. This is huge. I actually, like I mentioned in the beginning, I'm a lazy individual, right? Either I don't do or I do to the max, right? That's bad and good, right? So when I started doing research with big data clusters, I remember reaching out to a friend of mine who works at Microsoft on the SQL Server team. And I reached out to him and I said, you know, hey man, I know that, you know, there's NDAs and there's stuff obviously you cannot tell outsiders, right? I 100% agree with that. I accept that. But I want to ask you a question, right? I'm huge into big data clusters, but you know, just tell me this, right? Am I spinning my wheels or barking? Like, because I don't want to spend so much time doing this and then, because the passion was there. And it's like that was a Roadrunner, right? Where they're like spinning their wheel and then they just, I was spinning. I haven't taken off yet. I'm like, you know, just, is there anything you can tell me? Like, am I spinning my wheels here for no reason? I mean, is this going to be, because I really believe it's going to be the future of SQL Server, right? And I go into that a little bit. And he replies and he says, Microsoft is betting the farm on it, okay? So I was like, thumbs up, dude, right? Betting the farm on it. And then I had to go look on Google what the hell that meant, because I don't know what the hell looking of the farm and nothing like that. So I had to go look it up. And then I was like, that's awesome, dude. Oh, okay, that's good, you know? And then I continued to dive as deep, you know, it's a continuous dive, right? I don't want to say dive deep because I still consider myself a beginner. So I got to watch what I say there. But I'm absolutely in love with it and passionate about it. And I believe the reason why you should be excited is because, again, going to the third point, is a great opportunity to become relevant, right? You're not only learning a single feature in SQL Server, for example, like always encrypted or, you know, AG, right? Or anything like that, which I'm not saying anything, you know, negative about that. That's still, you know, good. This should be known. But there's this huge opportunity now where you are going to be stepping outside of your comfort zone, right? So if you are on Windows, if you're a Windows person like me, you need to learn Linux, like I mentioned, right? So you need to learn Linux, you need to know the basics of maneuvering Linux and this and that. And then you got to understand what containers are, right? And then Kubernetes, and I tell you right now, Kubernetes is like, I like to call it like the ocean, right? It's calm, right? It looks beautiful when you look at it from the top. You look at the ocean, you're like, oh, it's so beautiful and serene, you know? Conceptually, right? Oh, Kubernetes is so cool. And then you dive in and it's a whole different world, right? And it's like the abyss, right? It takes a lot of time and the learning curve is very steep, right? To get familiar with that, but it's there, right? And once, and for all the techies out there, including myself and people even, you know, watching later, there's no greater feeling than when you're struggling to understand a concept, to learn something or some code or something, and then you get it and then it executes and executes perfectly, or it makes sense. I mean, it's just like the best feeling ever, right? And I have gotten that feeling over and over and over on my path learning BDCs. But the path is steep. The learning curve is extremely steep. So with that, I'm going to leave you with the learning path. And this is tools and links and stuff that I used. Again, you've seen the link at the bottom of the pages, mohammaddarab.com/BDC. Everything this session, a curated list of BDC blog posts, and an Excel checklist that I have put links to Pluralsight courses. If you don't have Pluralsight, jump on it. Playgrounds, online playgrounds for Docker and Kubernetes, books that I've read, links, stuff like that, to learn those three concepts right there: Linux, Docker containers, and Kubernetes. Huge, huge, huge opportunity coming. So yeah. Any questions, feel free to ask, but that was my presentation. I really appreciate those who stuck around.